Robert Davi, a supporter of President Donald Trump. Tonight at 8 Eastern. The organizers of the 2017 Women's March on Washington held a women's convention in Detroit. This part of the event includes activists, advocacy group leaders, and Senator Bernie Sanders' former presidential campaign press secretary talking about how to dismantle oppression and end discrimination.
Good morning, everyone. How is everyone doing? Are we fired up? Are we ready to go? Yes, that's what I like to hear. Well, this morning, we're going to have an amazing conversation about intersectionality. But before we do that, I actually want to give some love to some folks. First of all, I just want to give some love back to all of you for showing up this early, so thank you. And I also just kind of want to say that, how many of you have gone to the Social Justice City? Yes. That is such an amazing place for me because initially it was a vision that was actually implemented by a woman named Nikita. And so I'm excited that you all have been able to go visit. But there's so many things that you all could participate in. And I just want to say that the GOTV team sent out 10,000 texts yesterday reminding people to vote next week in key races in Virginia, New Jersey, Michigan, and other states. They are in room 358 all weekend doing phone banking and texting. And so if we could go and visit them, please go there. But let's go ahead and get started here. All right, are we ready, ladies? Yes. We're going to bring up Jennifer Austin Jones, who is the CEO, head of Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, a New York City-based poverty-fighting policy and advocacy organization. Yay! We have Erika Andiola, who is the political director for Our Revolution, the future of grassroots and progressive politics. Let's give it up for Erika. We have Stosh, Cotler, who is the CEO of Bend the Arc Jewish Action, an unapologetically progressive national Jewish organization working for justice, inclusion, and equity in the U.S. Yes. We have Rebecca Cokley, who is a former Obama White House staff and senior fellow for disability policy at the Center for American Progress. Woo! We have Lilianna Reyes, who is a trans Latina working to uplift trans women of color voices. We have Maya Wiley, who is the Senior Vice President for Social Justice at the New School. Maya Wiley is the Senior Vice President for Social Justice and the former chair of the Independent Oversight Agency for New York City's Police Department. Yes. And last but not least, we have Zahra, who is the Executive Director of the San Francisco Bay Area Office of the Council of American Islamic Relations. So I have to say, I'm really excited to moderate this panel this morning because intersectionality is my existence. I am a Mexican-American Chicana woman who grew up in Southern California in a poor community where there was gangs, but I also grew up playing basketball. And so there are different things that I identify with, and intersectionality allows me to be my whole self. And what was really fascinating is when I studied Chicana feminism at UC Santa Cruz under the leadership of Aida Hurtado, I learned the word intersectionality. And it was actually coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 1980s. And it is that idea that social identities, systems of oppression, and group identities intersect to create a whole that is different from the component identities. So, with all that being said, a lot of us, while we were organizing the Women's March on Washington, were extremely intentional about being intersectional. And so with this panel, we're going to gain more knowledge of how we can actually begin to incorporate that term and that ideology into our work, but also our everyday lives. And I also want to say that although there was this visibility to it during the Women's March, people have been organizing intersectionally for many, many decades. So it's not a new concept, it's not a new term, but it's now becoming more visible. And so we're gonna go ahead and go across the board. And I know that we had previously talked about, like, you know, let's like, you know, just have and we're gonna have a casual conversation. Are you all ready for this? All right. So I first want to kind of start off with, because we have powerhouses on this stage right now. And I really wanted to start off with me asking all of you, especially because oftentimes people and women especially see all of you, see the powerful and the effective women and don't think it's achievable, right? Oftentimes you're like, okay, well, that person has been organizing for 20 years. How can I even get there? And so I kind of wanted to start by dispelling the myth that Rome was built in one day, right? And I want to ask all of you, what was your first job? Because when I was 11 years old, I had a paper route. How many of you had paper routes? Yes. And now I am the executive director of an organization, the co-founder, but it really took many years. And along that journey, it allowed me to embrace several identities, ideologies that have now supported my ability to become more intentional about my work. So we're gonna start with you.
Good morning, everybody. Excited to be here. Grateful for this opportunity to have a conversation with all of you and with this esteemed panel. So I am an anti-poverty policy and advocacy leader. I run an organization that is faith-rooted, but is concerned about the needs of all. It has in its name Protestant, and so what I use that to mean is that we care about all of our neighbors. We're not just religious-based. We're concerned about everybody. My first job, interestingly, was working on the Women, Infants, and Children program, doing research on WIC. WIC is a program that has existed for many years that is at risk right now. It provides food and supports to low-income mothers. And interestingly, I stumbled into it. I am a child, though, of a civil rights leader. I'm the child, grandchild, and great-grandchild of preachers and activists, social justice leaders. And so I think for me, growing up in a household where we were told to speak our truth, my daddy used to say all the time, freedom is the ability to say no to a lie, to veto an untruth. So growing up in a household where that's what was like poured into us, that's what formed who I am today, I believe.
Thank you. Is this on?
Yes.
Great. All right, my first job. So it depends. I'm an undocumented woman, so if you ask me what my first job legally was, when DACA came about, it's a whole different question. But my first job without papers was at a Chuck E. Cheese's. And I think for me, this question is, you know, it really informs a lot of my frustration that I developed as an undocumented woman. After Chuck E. Cheese, I actually worked at a daycare. I worked with a lot of undocumented women who were there for decades, you know, for almost a decade, sometimes working without documents like me. And at the same time, I was already graduated from Arizona State University, and so I was pretty much stuck at a job getting paid less than minimum wage in Arizona, and also with a diploma that I couldn't use. And so that really is one of the very first experiences that got me very, very angry at why I couldn't use my degree. Working in the daycare, love those babies, but it was really hard. It wasn't what I wanted to do. But I'm grateful that that happened because it really pushed me to figure out how to make that better, not just for me, but for other women.
Good morning, everyone, and it is an incredible honor to be here and to be among this group of women. My first job was in Olympia, Washington, washing dishes at the mall. When I moved out of my house when I was 16 and was working full-time and going to school full-time, and I was a punk rocker, had bright orange and hair and shaved head, and that was the job that I could get, and it was, at that time, a job actually that allowed me to pay my rent, which at this moment in time, that same job would not be a job that I could live on. So I'm grateful for that job.
Thank you.
First off, Carmen, I didn't know you were a slug.
I am a slug.
I'm
Banana
a slug too.
You are?
You're a slug too? Oh my God.
That means we went to UC Santa Cruz, the University of California, Santa Cruz. So we are slugs, banana slugs.
Perhaps the greatest, most intersectional school mascot that there is. My first job was being a bra specialist for Victoria's Secret. And what it taught me, and I still use it to this day because people always talk about, people are actually shocked that I include it a lot of times in my bio and still on my resume. And what I tell people is that public policy in lingerie is the exact same thing. You have to make people want to put their money out for something that in no way, shape, or form will actively impact their life. And it's usually filled with some substance, either hot air, oil, or something else unidentifiable. And you have to make them care about it. And lobbying and lingerie is, I use it in my day-to-day life every single day.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Lilianna Angel Reyes. I think my first job was, I was a tobacco and substance abuse awareness peer something. And I was 16 and I just did not want to work in fast food, so I just decided I could get a 6-hour-a-week office job to do, to literally write emails and make flyers. But ironically, it's led me to become an LGBT tobacco treatment specialist and a substance abuse specialist. Only because I did the work, and it seemed like any job I went to, they were like, oh, you did this work? Awesome, you can get the certification. And then everyone wanted it. So I became a specialist without wanting to become a specialist.
That's a hard one to top. So I, like Jennifer, grew up with parents who were civil rights activists. And so I want to distinguish work and job. Because I think one of the things that my parents and my grandparents before them taught us was that it takes work to be a citizen, and that our first job is citizenship. And with that, so if I talk about work as opposed to paid job, the first work was a bunch of us kids who were children of the activist organizers. It was the time of the Vietnam War, and we formed a group called Children Against the War. I think I was 7. And the leader of our group was someone you may know, Congressman Jamie Raskin, who I think was 8 at the time. And Jamie we would all meet at his house to have all 5 of us would meet at his house to have organizing meetings for the protest we were going to have against the war in Vietnam. And Jamie would pull out literally in their family room, he would pull out the coffee table and he'd stand on top of it and he'd lecture us about the evils of the war in Vietnam. Meanwhile, this other kid named David was shooting spitballs at my head, and I was trying to hide behind the chair. Anyway, but the point was, in the end of this, our parents helped us get a parade permit to have a march down Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House against the war in Vietnam. We were called Children Against the War. I think there were 6 of us by this time. We had added 1 more. And the police, expecting this huge, massive anti-war demonstration, had about 500 motorcycled police officers. And the only people on the sidewalks were our parents, which meant 10 to 12 people, cheering us on as we marched down saying, "Stop the war, stop the war."
Good morning, everyone. My name is Zahra Billoo, and I'm with CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and I'm not sure how to follow that. My first job was folding clothes at Mervyn's. Does anyone remember Mervyn's? Who was sad that it closed? My parents, I really wanted as a kid a food service job, which sounds odd to say out loud, especially if you know how hard food service jobs are, and my parents were not down with that. They were in pursuit of what we thought was the American dream, and they said, "We came all the way to America, you can't work in food service." And so I worked at Mervyn's, and I folded clothes during the holiday season. I will say that I am fortunate and also cognizant of the privilege that I had to work through college and to do it for extra money, not because I needed to pay my bills. But by the time I got to law school, I needed to work to pay my bills. And so as a product of California's public education system, I worked all the way through. And my favorite jobs, the ones that inform how I do my work today, were my times with the California Faculty Association, organizing professors and students to push back against tuition increases, and then with the Service Employees International Union, or SEIU as we know it, organizing home care workers and security guards, industries that are often not organized, but to recognize that we are more powerful when we work together.
I love all these stories. I think we could just keep going. And I will say that I think this allows us to kind of see how your lives are intersectional, right? We often think that we as women are monolithic, but we're not. And so in your organizing, in the work that you do every single day, why do you think it's important to organize across movements? And do you personally think that this is an effective way to build power?
So I'll begin. So in my daily work, I'm focused on poverty. I'm focused on the needs, the concerns of our neighbors, our brothers and sisters, some of us who don't have enough money to make ends meet on a daily basis. If the political and structural powers had it their way, they would look at it as just a class issue. They would look at it as independent of race experience, of gender experience. They would ignore the fact that when they talk about diversity, in the main, they separate race from gender, right? And so when you look at what, say, corporations do today, very often they place greater emphasis on gender, what that allows them to do, or they distinguish between race and gender and not the two together. So what that looks like is, if I want to meet the quotas, if you will, let me hire more women. They don't have to be women of color. Let me hire African American men. Let me hire Latino men. And then that leaves out African American women, Latino women, Indian women. Just go across the board. And so if I'm fighting poverty, I have to appreciate this intersectionality, and that movements have to coexist, that our issues are interdisciplinary, that we cannot just say poverty is a race issue alone, or it's a class issue alone, it's a gender issue alone. It has to be looked at together, and I have to fight for that intersectionality. One more point. Right now I'm looking at and I'm addressing issues of criminal justice reform. And what I'm appreciating increasingly is that what we do in America is that we don't appreciate that race and poverty and criminal injustice are all intersected. We look at taking on criminal justice reform as though it's just an experience tied to perhaps poverty. 80% of people incarcerated are poor. 60% of people incarcerated are Latino and Black. If we address criminal justice reform only through let's look at what's happening in the court systems, but let's not look at what's happening in Black and Latino communities, and look at how people don't have access to jobs, don't have access to education, people of color, then we miss the mark. That's why we have to focus on the intersection of all of these things. And the last point, you have to always remember that the structural powers that be want to keep things segmented. Because if we're over here focusing on class, then we're not appreciating the race undercurrent. If we're over here focusing on gender alone, we're not looking at how we're actually stripping away the economic potential. So we have to keep the movements focused on the intersectionality, so while they're trying to divide us, we remain united.
So how many of you paid attention to the 2016 presidential election? Because that's really the fundamental present-day answer to that question. What we saw in that election, number one, power should have represented that 3 million more votes resulted in a different president of the United States, okay? And the only reason 3 million plus votes did not was because of something called the Electoral College. And we have the Electoral College because we had slavery. So now the entire country has a man with his finger on the nuclear button who assaults women, who forgets the name of servicemen who die in the field, who has not dealt with dreamers' ability to continue to work and learn in this country, who has told us that police should be a little rough with people when they get put in police cars, maybe knock their heads up against the door, because we never have resolved the fact that as a country we have constructed a politics built on race, and race was also built on class and gender. It was. And we can't fight any of that unless we recognize that we are in it together. And that what it fundamentally represents is whether you're a coal miner in Kentucky or a garment worker in New York or simply a woman taking care of a family at home, that fundamentally what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said remains true, which is that fundamentally we're bound up together. And either we're going to rise together or we're going to fall, and we're going to take the rest of the world with us. So what that means in terms of our organizing is fundamental, right? It means that we have to see the relationship between police misconduct, as Jennifer said, criminal justice, education and investment in education, healthcare, immigration, because all of these have become push-button issues to do exactly what Jennifer said, to divide us. But we don't have to let that be the case if we actually see the relationships and be in relationship in all of these fights in the way that we can be. There's nothing more important than after NFL players started taking a knee during the national anthem, than that a white woman who was going to sing the national anthem took her knee while she sang it.
Okay, sorry, I didn't. So I think intersectionality is important because we see the impact of what happens to extremely marginalized people when public awareness heightens. So for instance, when the LGBT movement, which is a very white movement, started to take off, LGBT, specifically trans people of color, were left behind. The year that gay marriage, the year and the year after that gay marriage was legal, there was the highest number of trans women of color murdered that's ever been documented. And so when we think about trans women of color and the amount of people that are murdered simply because of who they are, if you're not doing intersectionality, then you're part of that violence. You're part of the people that are killing me and us. And this is a worldwide phenomena. So in the United States, black trans women are murdered at significantly higher rates, and in the world, Latina trans women are murdered at significantly higher rates. And that's not because of anything, but if I go to the gas station and I'm authentically me, I can get shot. And nothing happens to the people that killed me. Nothing happens to the community that let it happen. So intersectionality is undoing that work and not allowing people like me to be afraid to walk in the streets.
Rebecca.
So I heard at latest count there are 5,000 women here, right? 5,000? Isn't that the latest count that I've been seeing it on social media?
About 4,200.
Yeah, okay, well, if there were 5,000 women here,
They're watching. There's more than 5,000 watching.
Me up here. 1,250 of you are my people. If you're a cancer survivor, you're a woman with a disability. If you have an eating disorder, you're a woman with a disability. If you have ever gone to therapy in your life, you are a woman with a disability. If you're coming through substance abuse and recovery, you're one of ours. And I am here to tell you right now that the House of Representatives is pushing H.R. 620, which will systematically dismantle Title III of the ADA, so you couldn't even come to this convention because you couldn't get in the damn door. Over 400 arrests this year. Over 400 disabled activists were arrested for all of your health care. 400. Yet we are continually erased anytime they rattle off the list of people who put their lives on the line to save health care. Over 900 dead in Puerto Rico today is the latest news. Over 900. That's not even talking about the hundreds of people with disabilities that were impacted going into the storm, and all of those people coming out of the storm that have acquired disabilities as a result. Those are my people. Those are all of your people. I come in this space as a woman with a physical disability, and I have that privilege. No one's gonna ask me no one's gonna question my need for a stool. But if it's 1 in 4 of us, that means right now, if you do a quick count of the panel, I'm not the only one up here. But I have the privilege of being able to disclose. If we are going to push back on 620 and preserve the rights for all of our people, you need to acknowledge the fact that disabled women are already in your movement.
So I need to add to what Rebecca said. While we've been organizing the convention and the Women's March, we have several people who work with us on ADA. And when we were putting together a campaign for our sister Linda, and we wrote the hashtag I Stand With Linda, what it does, it erases so many people who can't stand. And so even that intentionality is important when we're putting together narratives and stories and hashtags, that we have to ensure that we are bringing other people to the table.
Definitely, thank you. So I think for me, the work that I do right now, it's, I do work in electoral politics through a revolution. And intersectionality for me in politics is also very important, because for me, I'm not looking at, who can we support as an organization, or who can we really lift up as a candidate just because they're female, or because, they believe that we should be having, the right for that they believe in reproductive justice, etc. For me, I want to be able to lift up women, not just because they are women, but because they have the right intentions through, fixing problems in the communities that I come from, and that a lot of the people that I know that are usually not, paid attention to come from. And so, just to give you a little bit of story, before I was working for the Bernie campaign, just to disclose this. Just gonna disclose it. I don't want to talk about the politics of 2016, but just, just to give you a little bit of a sense of why I started working, was for me, I was actually, before I went into the campaign, I was working for the Guatemalan consulate. I'm not Guatemalan, but I wanted to work with them because I wanted to work with children that were coming from Central America. And for me, it was so heartbreaking to hear the stories of the little girls who literally had to take contraceptive pills to be able to cross the border because they knew that they were going to get raped, or because they were getting ready to be raped. They were mentally ready to be raped as they were crossing the border. And some of them were here, 14-year-old girls, already pregnant. And all of this was happening and nobody was talking about it. And to me, when I went into I was looking at candidates, I was like, who is talking about these girls? Who's talking about these children who are coming through Central America? And perhaps, they're not, but I want to lift it up and I want to see who is there for those children, right? And unfortunately, I didn't see that in the women. And so to me is, in my work, I want to make sure in the work that you're doing locally in elections and electoral work, we need to lift up women who are progressive, who are willing to look at the world in an intersectional way that is not just about reproductive justice that we're fighting for, but also, you know, women who perhaps have problems because of their race and because of their class and because of, you know, a disability or anything else that we're going through, or our gender identity, etc. So yeah, for me that's very important.
Thank you.
So, two things. One, thank you, Rebecca. I'm always excited to be on panels where I learn something new. And as a woman who goes to therapy, I did not know that that counted as being a woman with a disability. But you're right that it is definitely difficult to disclose. It's something that I've been doing for 2 years, because how does one do this work over and over again and continue to show up and be full and be present and be whole without getting professional help? Like, so thank you. Thank you for starting that conversation and for supporting those of us that are trying to figure out how to disclose and how to normalize that this is what we do to get help and be whole. That's the first thing. The second thing is really just a story. I shared in my introduction that I'm the daughter of immigrants who came to the United States in pursuit of the American dream. And though we were raised in a faith-based home where we knew that social justice was a part of our being, we didn't necessarily connect that to challenging the police, to challenging the war on drugs, or to questioning government. And so growing up, we watched Cops and Walker, Texas Ranger, and all of those other horrendous shows that glorified law enforcement, and didn't think that the war on drugs had anything to do with us as a South Asian immigrant family. Fast forward to 2010, and a young Arab American man walks into my office, and I'm a new lawyer at the time, and he says, "I found a GPS tracking device on my car." I was like, "That sounds like a television show. What are you talking about?" He says, "I took my car in for an oil change, and we happened to look under it," which not something I've ever done, "and we found a device, and it was bigger than the iPhone 6. And we found a battery pack with it, and we took it off, and we didn't know what it was. And so we took a picture of it, and we posted it online. And the other tech geeks online helped us figure out through the tracking number on it, or the serial number on it, that it's a tracking device. And 2 days later, the FBI showed up at his door and asked for it back." I kid you not. And I wouldn't believe it if we didn't have the Freedom of Information Act documents to prove it, and had we not sued them to learn more. But along the way, what I learned as a daughter of immigrants was that this was not the first time this had happened. It had been happening to Black and Latino communities for decades. Our lawsuit was not even the first lawsuit. There were existing lawsuits. It took the Supreme Court well over 10 years to say to a Black man on the East Coast who had similarly found a device on his car, "That's a violation of your Fourth Amendment rights." And by the time they decided that, law enforcement was no longer using devices that big. They were just getting the information directly from the tech companies. And I share this story because for me it was a turning point in recognizing that it's one thing to talk about intersectionality, but it's another thing to care about an issue that doesn't seem like it impacts me in the moment. I'd like to say that we should all come to this selflessly because it's the correct thing to do. But there's also a selfish reason to do it. If we don't stop them when they come for our brothers, sisters, siblings, cousins, friends, co-panelists, and neighbors, they will come for us in the same exact way.
Thank you. Stosh? Okay, so wow, being the last person to answer this question on this panel is an intense experience. So I'll just say a few things that, for me, if the endeavor is actually social transformation as opposed to social reform, then intersectionality is absolutely necessary. that we cannot actually qualitatively make a very different world, an unrecognizable world, without doing this work in a different way. And so to me, it feels like it is a key feature of what is needed for all of us. I also want to reflect what Rinku Sen said last night, that as women and people with different identities and experiences and who have compounded experiences with oppression are at the table actually architecting the vision for governing in the future, it will mean that our public policies will look and be entirely different, and they will not leave people behind, and they will actually reflect all of us and all of the people who we are connected to in a really very, very different way. And then finally, I'll say that I believe that the work of intersectionality is actually healing, and that there is a way in which we are making an ancestral and lineage repair when we do this work of intersectional organizing. And I want to say how meaningful it was. Last night, a group of Jews were gathered to bring in Shabbat, the Sabbath, and we, by the convention organizers, we were provided a space where we could gather and sing and pray. And not only that, because some Jews observe Shabbat by not spending money and are observing dietary laws, and so the organizers had gone to the effort of not just providing a space, but providing food so that the people who wanted to be at this convention could not have to choose between Jewish observance and practice and participating. And that was an actual concrete demonstration of what it means. And for Jews, that was deeply healing. That is so healing, because many of us, including people who are white Jews like myself, although it is important to say that the Jewish community is a multiracial community with 10 to 20% of Jews who are Jews of color, that we often feel alone, that we've experienced thousands of years of murder and displacement and genocide. And so right now, while it looks like someone like myself is safe, we also know that it is cyclical, and that it is precisely when it appears the safest and it appears the most invisible that we are at the greatest risk. And we also know that we are right now less at risk than every single person on this panel. And so it is our job, I would say, to be clear that we are all in this together, and that what happened last night was a profound moment of healing. So thank you.
I may add one more point. As I listen and I appreciate and I learn, which again is critically important, I'm also reminded of the fact that if we don't organize across movements, we run the risk of the oppressed becoming the oppressor. Right? Where wins are achieved for a certain group, a certain segment of the population, to the detriment of other segments of the population. Do you understand what I'm saying? Let's take, feminism. Let's take the black woman's response to feminism in the 60s and 70s when Alice Walker coined the term womenism, because she believed that the black woman's experience was not fully represented in the feminist movement. Black women were struggling for survival. They wanted to care for their families, right? They were beginning to see the impact of incarceration, unemployment, underemployment on their families. And the feminist movement was focused on sex and independence, right? Freedoms, right? The right to have your own voice. And so the needs, the concerns of the black community and the black woman weren't fully represented. Well, if we'd left that alone, then we look forward, we have black women fighting against white women. We don't want that. You take Sheryl Sandberg. Did anybody read the book Lean In? Good book. But in Lean In, Sandberg says that women just have to aspire to be more, to get ahead. We need to be more assertive. We need to be more aggressive. She actually has said in commentary about that book that black women just don't lean in enough. What she doesn't appreciate is that black women have been found through research to be more assertive, to be more aggressive. But the fact is that they're kept from the table. So in lifting up the experience of women as a whole and not understanding the nuanced experiences of women of color, she ignores that. And in turn, again, it gets termed a gender issue. And maybe some get ahead, but others don't. We have to be careful about the oppressed becoming the oppressor.
I love that, because I will say that in planning the Women's March and planning the Women's Convention, there are often times that I find myself alongside with my other three co-chairs, particularly Tamika and Linda, the women of color, being called fake feminist. And what it has me understand is that white radical feminism does not include black feminism and Chicana feminism, so it doesn't include me. And what I also have learned in my studies as a Chicana feminist is the fact that feminism was founded in the late 1800s by a man named Charles, who was a French philosopher. And so the initial iteration of feminism had some patriarchy in it. And the white suffrage movement, although I'm extremely grateful for the gains that I am able to experience and the privileges that I have, but it did not include black women. And then black feminism was introduced, and that's when Chicana feminism were able to then talk about how we were a part of something that we have always been living every single day. When I studied Chicana feminism, when they were describing what a feminist was, I was like, that is my mother. And I never labeled it. And so again, we have to think about what that even looks like, if we are intentional, if we are inclusive. And that segues into my question of what are the challenges of organizing intersectionally? What are the challenges that we find ourselves? Because when we were putting together the policy platform within the Women's March, everyone wanted to march against Trump, and that would have been the easy thing to do, but we had to actually march for something. And what we had to ask people to do is we brought together about 27 to 30 women, gender nonconforming and trans women, to talk about their issue and finding their intersectionality through a gender lens. And that was accomplished. And so we marched for immigrant rights, LGBTQIA rights, criminal justice reform. And so, but it's not easy. And so as we talk about organizing and making sure that we are intentional and making sure that we are intersectional, it doesn't happen overnight. So what are some of the challenges that you all face in your organizing and trying to be intentional and intersectional?
So I will start, and I want to start with something Rebecca said, because it's being intersectional and working in an intersectional way also means, because it will go to one of the challenges, also means recognizing that when we support the fights on specific issues that impact communities that we may not always identify ourselves with, we benefit. So one example was when people with disabilities fought for the ADA and won sidewalk cuts in the streets, who benefited? Everyone pushing a stroller, right? Elderly people with walkers. When women fought to become police officers and brought sex discrimination cases against police departments that had arbitrary requirements on height, short white men got to become cops for the first time. I say that because one of the challenges with working intersectionally sometimes is recognizing that, in the words of Audre Lorde, we don't live single issue lives. We don't, right? At the same time, there are times when we must push on particular issues. And that can be difficult for people with limited resources and time sometimes to recognize why they should push on a specific issue that might not be their primary issue in the moment. And these examples of recognizing the gains that will come to everyone in defending the rights and demanding the investment in particular issues at particular points in time is sometimes the most strategic thing to do and demonstrates exactly what I also think Jennifer is talking about, not becoming the oppressor as we fight for issues we might be putting most of our time in.
I think for the disability community, it's sort of two-pronged. One, I want to go back to, Carmen, what you were talking about when it came to the plan, the Women's March plan. And when I first saw the draft from the disability community, and I saw that the original draft was composed by 8 people, 7 of which were white, 4 of whom were men, I'm not gonna lie, I had to blow the damn thing up. And I did it just for shits and giggles. Because it said the #1 issue facing disabled women was the UN Convention on the Civil Rights of People with Disabilities, which I'm sorry, 50% of the people being killed by cops right now are people with disabilities. 80% of women with intellectual disabilities are raped or assaulted by 18. The UN Convention is important, but it's not going to impact our lives on the ground. We need fair pay. We need family leaves. Our issues are fundamentally women's issues. So it meant deconstructing that even within, it meant talking to our own community and saying this is bullshit. This does not represent who our people are. How do we rebuild it? How do we reframe it and center the voices of women of color with disabilities to ensure that it's representative of all of our folks with mental health disabilities, of our folks with eating disorders, of our folks with chronic conditions, Crohn's, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, those of y'all that might not come to the rally for us, but we know you're included in the mix. And I think the challenge for us has been, and I would strongly encourage folks to take a moment and Google the Harriet Tubman Collective, and particularly look at completing the vision for Black lives, because in the plan for the movement for Black lives, disability is pretty much significantly erased in it. And it was Black disabled leaders that went back and said, let us create a supplement to this. Let us make sure that Natasha McKinnon's experience as a Black disabled woman is not erased in this document. Let us make this more fulfilling. So it's not only looking at our community's issues with being too damn pale, male, and stale, but it's also being willing to come to the table with all of y'all and have the tough conversation saying, we're not here, but we're already in your mix. How can we help you fix this?
I appreciate the point that Rebecca is making, because I think that one of the challenges that we face is that sometimes we make assumptions. That if we've got a segment, a certain person in the conversation, we can check the box. Oh, now we understand all of the issues of persons with disabilities, so we don't need to learn anymore. We don't need to look any further. We don't need to unmask some of the things that are not right in our face. One of the examples that I'm always reminded of, being concerned about issues of criminal justice reform and the intersection with poverty and with race, is that, you know, as people move forward trying to make strides in tackling over-incarceration in this country, the experience in, communities of color with respect to arrest and incarceration, one of the efforts that has been underway for a while now is something called Ban the Box. Everybody familiar with Ban the Box? When you go to complete an application for employment, and there's a little box, have you ever been arrested? Have you ever been convicted of a crime? Have you ever been, have you ever had to be imprisoned? Well, there's been an effort in many jurisdictions across the country to get rid of that box. Feels good, right? But what we don't appreciate is if we don't lean in, that Black male who fills out a job application that cannot account for 2 years or 4 years or 6 years, it's not going to be assumed that he was home taking care of mama because she was sick, right? It's not because mom was dying and he needed to be there. The assumption is going to be, whether he checked that box or not, he was somewhere else. He was, quote, off to college, i.e. he was incarcerated. So we have to appreciate that if we don't dig deeper and we don't understand how reality plays in to the policies that we're seeking to change, the reforms, and how people are going to interpret them. The box may be gone, but the mindset is still there. And so we have to challenge that.
One of the things that I really appreciate about Carmen and Linda and Tamika and the co-chairs, and really appreciate what you're saying, is that there are women who are actually coming into the space and saying, I don't see what I should be seeing on this platform. I don't see this issue being here, talked about, or your space is not talking about certain people that we should be talking about and their issues. And so for me, it's also, I'm just really trying to get people to be empowered to speak up when they have to. Because the fact is that, we all have, sometimes we're not completely aware of the things that we should be including in our own platforms as organizations, or as politicians, or as people who are putting together a convention. I mean, sometimes we do have those blind spots, and that's why it's important that we have women who are willing to come and be really strong and be really upfront and say, you're missing my voice, or you're missing the voice of my mother, or the voice of the people that I love. And so I think for us it's also really important to do that, not just keep on calling each other out, but rather let's figure out how we can have a conversation to get people to understand that we have to have other voices also in these kinds of gatherings, or even on political platforms, anything that we're trying to use to push social change forward.
It seems pretty obvious on some level, but it feels to me like one of the fastest ways to address the challenges is actually to be in relationship with one another, and to actually understand that we live in a society that deliberately segregates us, and that even those that live in proximity with one another are trained to distrust and be in opposition to one another so that systems of power can continue. So to proactively build and reach across the many differences gives us the ability then to understand one another's lives and actually hear about what it's like to be you, and what it's like to be me, and what it's like to be you. And then we have less of a chance to mess it up in the first place. But then when we do, because it is inevitable that we live in a world that is so broken that in the process of repairing it, we will make mistakes. It means that we have the relationships and the trust and actually the love and the care for one another, that we can have the conversations that are brave conversations, that we apologize, and then we actually act different. But that only happens if we build relationships intentionally, and if we build relationships over time, not just one time at a conference, but actually years and years of getting to know one another and loving one another.
So I would say that the challenge with intersectionality can sometimes be that if my people are dying, if it is our lives on the line and it is bad news, bad news, bad news every day, it takes hard work to stop and say, wait, we're not the only ones. We're not the only ones suffering, we're not the only ones impacted, and this isn't the only way in which oppression is happening. But I'll tell you that when I'm drowning in work on the Muslim ban, I have to be intentional about coming up for air and thinking, what's going on with DACA? What's going on with healthcare? What's going on with anti-Semitism? But that takes intentionality. It takes the transformational relationships, the ones that aren't just transactional, where I see you at a conference and we say, how are you? And no one really gives an open and honest answer about that. It takes actually hearing from people in the communities that are next to us, that are neighboring us, and that are intersecting with us about what's going on for them. But I think the other thing, the way forward, even when we're not doing full-time intersectional work, or maybe all I have time to work on is what's killing my people, is to make sure that we are not becoming the oppressors, that I am not willing to accept a win for my people if it comes on someone else's back. I am not willing to sacrifice anyone else's liberty for my liberty. So if we fight Islamophobia without fighting anti-Semitism, if we fight for immigration reform without talking about why people are migrating worldwide and what it is about our foreign policy that forces them to move, if we are willing to close some jails but not others, if we ban the box but don't get bail reform, if we ban the box but don't get restorative justice, then those aren't wins. And so even when I feel like I am drowning and maybe all I have time to work on is one issue, I have to be sure that when I am moving that issue, that I am moving it forward for everyone, and I am not sacrificing anyone else's rights for the sake of my own.
Lilianna, do you have any challenges you want to discuss?
I think we have to understand our perception of when we work with people. So in my line of work as a trans woman of color, I am highly educated, highly degreed, and highly credentialed. And I say that because I had to do that to navigate the space. People wouldn't just hire me because I'm a trans person. That's not how that works. So because I have all of that, it means that I really try really hard to know what I'm talking about and know what I'm doing. But because I work with people that have historically not worked with trans women of color leaders outside of a community organizing, people assume that I am a client. So the perception that trans women of color are usually seen as a client when I go into nonprofit government worlds, they assume I'm a client. So they look at me as I'm speaking as a client versus speaking as a specialist. And so that directly impacts the power that they feel like they have over me. I've been given books about how to write logic models. I have a master's in public administration. They taught me how to write logic models. So when I'm talking to people and they're like, let me help you with resources, it's because they assume I don't know anything. And so when you think about how you're working with people in your communities, how are you perceiving them? Are you only working with them because they're clients? And if you are, then you have a power over them, and maybe you really do have a power over them and they just allow it. That impact versus intentionality, like it really doesn't care what your intent is. If it hurts, it hurts. So be mindful of your perception.
All these points and challenges is so critical, but there's one we should name that we haven't, I think, frontally named, which is trauma. We live in a country that has produced so much trauma across so many communities, whether it's young women who have to be prepared to be raped when they cross a border, whether it's being a trans woman that has to worry just walking down the street about whether you're going to be physically attacked, whether it's being the person with disability who showed up at the job interview on time in a wheelchair and then got asked, but how will you get to work on time? All of these things are various forms of trauma. And I would say white communities who do not always agree with us on policy issues have also suffered trauma. And some of the positions they take, which I think are fundamentally against the best interests of the country, are also born of trauma. And I think that unless we start to recognize that it sometimes is very hard to work together because of the trauma experiences that we all carry, until we start to demand a country that actually invests in mental health and mental health services. Because the reality is, no one has to suffer from trauma. There are treatments. There are treatments available, and you have to be wealthy to pay for them. And so I just say this to say that it is actually a challenge to intersectional work. It's a challenge to all of our work, and it's even a challenge to come together as a country and have the kind of dialogue on facts that will produce the policy outcomes we need to invest in a prosperous future for all of us.
So much appreciating what you're saying, Maya. I'm going to harken us back to a comment you made earlier about all of this being steeped in structural racism, sexism, and classism. And this appreciation that, one of the greatest challenges that we also experience in intersectional work, is that we show up to the table, but we show up bringing our identity alone to the table. And so we speak from our own perspective and our own vantage point, which is critically important, but we're not necessarily listening in, trying to really understand the experiences of others and how that all works together. And the fact of the matter, speaking to your point, is that if we don't appreciate that we're not just fighting a fight for some rights, we're fighting a fight for all rights. If we don't appreciate that what we're really trying to do is to take down structural and institutional racism, classism, sexism, right? And all of the phobias that are born out of it, then we lose sight of the bigger vision. And then we actually lose the war. So we start fighting these little fights and we lose the bigger war. The importance, the work that we have to do is to not only educate ourselves about the issues that we work on a daily basis, but really try to get understanding. Be an expert in our own spaces, but at least try to be the best generalists we can be about the people who we are intersecting with and their issues and their concerns, so we can fight the war together.
And so before we close this panel plenary out, let's just give everyone a round of applause for being so brilliant and intentional and amazing. And some of the takeaways that we have for today is we have to be intentional in our organizing, understanding that there are times when we invite people to the table that we also may have to give up our seat. There's a lane for everyone to get involved. And also, let's be mindful of those that have been oppressed and for us to not become oppressors. Let's be open, let's listen, let's lean in, let's dig deep within ourselves, right? Let's keep our eyes on the prize, on our mission and our vision and liberation. Let's not make assumptions about one another. Let's proactively challenge ourselves and our organizations, as well as have brave conversations, build intentional and transformational relationships with one another. And so there is so much that we can do, and this is a journey, this is a process. Learning is a process. Intentionality is a process. We are going to make mistakes, but let's be mindful that while we're seeking our own liberation, that we are not hurting others on our journey there. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Can we end on one note of hope, though, on this podium? Because I just want to call this out because it's so important. So when black players in the National Football League started taking a knee, one of the things they did was created a list of principles. And on that list of principles, they not only talked about police misconduct, which is critically important, they talked about sexism, they talked about immigration, they talked about internationalism, they talked about investing in communities, and that it was an example in a place where we do not as a country typically think about intersectional leadership, and men who we don't usually think of as intersectional leaders absolutely representing the power and the importance of intersectionality.
And on that note, in regards to men, I also want to say, I think what's really beautiful about black feminism is that during the time when that was being put together, what they recognized, black feminists recognized, is that they were also fighting alongside their fathers, their sons, their husbands. And so when we're talking about inclusivity, we also have to include our men in the conversation. And so I just want to highlight that, because I know that I'm able to do the work that I do because I have an amazing father, I have amazing brothers, and I have a wonderful boyfriend who's somewhere here named Jaron Jordan. Thank you, everyone. All right, thank you. Enjoy today's sessions.
The Sojourner Truth Lunch honoring Congresswoman Maxine Waters, begins at 11:45 here in Hall D. The program will commence at noon.